Good morning. Welcome, everybody. I suppose as part of the other home team here, welcome to the University of Texas. Welcome back for most of you. And thanks for the great introduction, Eve. Good to see you, of course. So the theme here, politics and the 2023 legislative session, narrowed down very nicely. I want to introduce our panel. I think we have somebody on the way. So I'm going to go from left to right, broadly speaking. On my immediate left, Brad Johnson is a senior reporter for the Texan, where for the past 3.5 years, he's covered the Texas legislature and state politics with a focus on fiscal policy and energy. Next to Brad is Niki Griswold. Many of you will recognize as a state politics reporter for the Austin American-Statesman. This is her first stint, she tells me, public stint here, as since she moved to the Statesman, she worked as a political reporter for Spectrum News in Austin for a few years. And next to Niki is James Barragán, who is a politics reporter for the Texas Tribune with a focus on accountability reporting. Prior to joining the Tribune, he worked as a State House reporter for the Dallas Morning News with previous stints at the aforementioned Statesman and the Los Angeles Times, kind of his hometown newspaper, broadly speaking. Yes. If you're from Southern California, close enough, right? And we're hoping to be joined in a bit by Taylor Goldenstein, who is a state reporter from the Houston Chronicle. And, you know, I'm just going to say for Taylor, it's Austin, traffic, all right? All right, guys, so, we've talked about this. Let's start broadly. We just came out of an election campaign in which a lot of the discussion during the campaign was about the competing agendas of the two parties. In Texas, one party won decisively. So I think I want to start by looking at how you all think the winning party is interpreting that election win and how that's going to affect the agenda going into the legislature. I'm going to start at my immediate left.
So obviously, Texas Republicans had a lot better night than national Republicans, and I think they'd be the first to admit that and tout that. That sets the table for quite a fight in the legislature, especially among Republicans. I think we're going to see fights over something like school choice. That's going to be knockdown, drag out. How much do we spend the surplus on and for what purpose? We saw Lieutenant Governor Patrick and the rest of the LBB set the cap without busting it, set the cap for spending that surplus at like $12.5 billion. That'll evaporate pretty quickly, and the estimated $27 billion would already evaporate pretty quickly with all these different interests. A big fight will be on property taxes. We heard the governor during his campaign stress multiple times that he wants to use at least half of the $27 billion on directly cutting property taxes. Patrick said at his press conference that's probably not doable unless we either, quote, get creative or bust the cap, which he does not want to do. I don't think many Republicans want to do that. They don't want to set that precedent, at least in the words of Lieutenant Governor Patrick. So it's going to be like it has for the last 20 years, a lot of internal fighting between the Republicans and issues important to them mainly. And then you will always have the threat of another quorum break, or at least thoughts of what happened last year. How much do we push the issue and maybe have another one of those on our hands? I don't think Democrats really want to do that again, but if they feel they need to, I think they probably will. But maybe it won't come to that. But they're going to see a lot of Republican gauging how much can we push through, along with trying to compromise amongst themselves on the various issues that divide them.
For the rest of it, to expand that discussion, how do we handicap that? Please, either one of you jump in there. In other words, I think that's a pretty good summary of what's going on out there with the budget surplus sort of hovering out there. But in a lot of the things you mentioned, as you said, there's a lot of contention. Is there any way to handicap that at this point? What do you think, Niki? In terms of, who's going to favor what and what has pride of place right now? And look, we can all be straight. I mean, the that people are talking about most really is property taxes. But I think below that, there's even disagreement about how to do that and where that should be in terms of the other competing priorities.
Yeah, I think when it comes to how Texas Republicans are interpreting the election results, I kind of read their response as seeing it as an endorsement of the issues that they chose to prioritize during their campaigns: border security and law enforcement, as well as the economy, and as Brad mentioned, lowering property taxes. That was also reflected in Patrick's list of priorities for the upcoming session. I think what we didn't see on there was school choice, which, you know, historically has been a battle between more rural Republicans and urban Republicans who overwhelmingly support that issue. I think when it comes to handicaps and fissures in the Republican Party, I'm looking mostly towards school choice as a big issue for them to deal with.
It's going to be horse trading, honestly, because you know, we're all talking about what the lieutenant governor has said, and he's a shrewd politician. He's put out his priorities, but you know, those priorities, particularly on property taxes, bump up against the governor, who says he wants to use half of that $27 billion surplus for property taxes. The lieutenant governor is already saying, hey, you know, there's no easy way to do that, so let's figure out ways around it. And then the House Speaker is saying, well, how about we use some of that money for infrastructure, right? And so we've got all these different ways that people want to use the money, and then we've got other minor, smaller, well, I guess not minor for the people who it might happen to, but smaller issues in the grand scheme, like this thing about making illegal voting felony again, right? Which the House Speaker said last time during the special session, like, this is not the time to do it. But he didn't say no. So now during a regular session, maybe it is the time to do it, right? And maybe you trade that one and you tick off all the Democrats, but hey, you move on the infrastructure, right? It's the horse trading that's happening here. So I think that's what this session is mostly going to be about. Who is going to get what from the big three and from like just the Republicans in general. It really is a Republican world, and everybody else is just kind of living in it, right? But it's to your first question, I think it's just going to be a continuation of what we saw in 2021. Because if in 2020 Democrats really gave it a shot to take over the House, and the people spoke, and Republicans won, and they held the numbers in the House, and they held the numbers in the Senate, and they took that as a mandate to go and just like run the gamut, run the table, and do everything that they wanted to do, right? And so if that was in 2020 and in 2021, they gained even a small gain, but it's a gain, then why would they do anything different? So I think we're just going to see a continuation of what we've seen before.
You know, that's a good way of kind of transitioning to something we were all talking about in the green room a little bit, because you know, and as I said back there, all of these, I'm going to list a few oppositions. They're all overly simple, and if you called me as reporters, I would tell you that, but now I get to be a moderator and use shorthand. So, you know, I'm wondering how you guys weigh the relative weights of the different cleavages that you raised at the outset. I mean, you know, we could make it a big list and people would have their own to add. You know, the friction, but you know, the traditional friction between the House and the Senate, even when the same party controls both. There's the friction between, you know, you pick your arm of the unstable triad of the big three of the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the speaker. All kinds of internecine conflicts between and tensions, personality and policy-wise there. You know, within the Republican Party, and this is where it gets hardest, I think, you know, there's sort of the center governing right and the far right. There's also, as we were saying in the back, the agenda cleavage within the Republican Party between, broadly speaking, a kind of developmentalist wing. I mean, I was really glad you raised infrastructure, James, because that's something that's really lurking out there, and yet it seems to be kind of slow played by the elements of the Republican leadership that are talking about that, versus more of an emphasis on social issues, a continuation of 2021. Like, you got any sense of what is most important, or what's really, how those shake out? Yeah, go, James.
Oh, go ahead, Brad. Go ahead. All right. Yeah.
All right, I'll go.
What gentleman?
like Niki said, property taxes is going to be the biggest issue. One thing that really interests me on this specifically in relation to the surplus that we have, the Lieutenant Governor, when he said we either bust the cap or we, quote, get creative, he didn't go into too much detail on this, but the way it sounded was he suggested passing constitutional amendments for singular items of spending. And so the idea is that if you pass, a property tax buy down of, $13 billion, that would bust the cap that we already have. But if you pass it as a constitutional amendment and the voters approve it, then it doesn't count towards that cap. This is a strategy, as far as I know, has never been used before. At least I checked with the Legislative Reference Library, and they had never seen that before. But I think there was a cap busted in 2007, was it? So there is precedent for that. But this is a unique proposal that potentially could get a lot of spending items across the line, whether it's infrastructure or property taxes or you name it, especially in this time where we are seeing, as Speaker Phelan mentioned, the cost of purchasing materials that we would use to build the infrastructure is drastically higher than it was 2 years ago. And so that's going to put even more pressure on using what the amount of money we have is smartly, and also saving some in the bank, because this is not, as Comptroller Hager has said frequently to anybody that will listen, is that this historic surplus is not a sign of great economic times. Part of it is the economy returning from the pandemic slowdown, jobs being gained, businesses starting investment more, spending just happening a lot more. But also it comes with inflation. And so with a state-funded tax system based on consumption taxes, that can be pretty volatile, as we saw with the pandemic. So that is something I'm going to be watching a lot, and I would love to hear more details on that from the Lieutenant Governor.
Well, just as it relates to how the relationships between the House and the Senate are, one important thing is that, the boring stuff is important. Redistricting is important, right? And I'm the nerd. I'm the one that brought up infrastructure. So the boring stuff is important.
Everybody's got a role to play. So.
Yeah. And in the last session, obviously it was a redistricting session, and they redrew the boundaries of Senate District 10. If Senate District 10, that's Beverly Powell's former district now, it's going to be represented by Phil King. But if that district had stayed in the bounds of Tarrant County, it's very likely that would have been a Democratic district again. Now that it is not, now that it is run by a Republican, and because it got extended out to the west and south to much more rural areas and much wider areas that tend to vote more for Republicans, that makes it 19 in the Senate. So that means the Lieutenant Governor can really run his agenda without any really Democratic help. And so that takes us back to like a 2017 session where they're just passing stuff out in like February and March. And, back then Speaker Strauss was trying to slow roll some things, but the pressure was on them. And so I think that is sort of, it could potentially be, I haven't had conversations, but just reading the tea leaves, that's sort of what it could set up. And with a new speaker, by that point, Speaker Strauss had a couple of sessions, and he had, played this game with Lieutenant Governor Strauss with a newer speaker who really in his first session kind of just let the House run itself. I don't know if that's by design. He said it's by design, or if that's just kind of his style, and he likes the chaos, or they're, conservative issues that he supports. All of that was unclear to me, but his stated intent was that the House is going to run itself. With that pressure from the Senate, I think that sets up an interesting dynamic, because it puts the pressure then, if they pass school vouchers in the Senate, if they pass some type of property tax legislation, well, I guess the property tax legislation would be different because that would be in the budget, one would think. But if they pass any of these more culture war issues, another thing we haven't talked about is like the LGBT wars that we're seeing, the book bans that we're seeing. if they put the pressure by passing those things in like February and March, and then the House is sitting on them, then the grassroots aren't going to be happy, and they will make their voices known. And so I think that's an interesting dynamic that will play out probably.
I will say that the lieutenant governor has, even if Senate District 10 had stayed blue, the lieutenant governor has previously shown
And he said he would
no
change the rule.
inability
Yeah, he said he
to
would change the rule,
reduce
right.
the supermajority.
I always like that pregnant pause before somebody says something about the lieutenant governor. It actually speaks to the dynamic you're talking about.
I mean, he's pretty clear about it, and I don't know if Senator Powell were to have won her race, sought re-election, won her race, I don't know if that would have changed much, just because of the way the Senate is run now and how much power the lieutenant governor has, especially when he has a supermajority.
Yeah, and a quick note about the Senate as well. I think it's important to note that with Senator Seliger choosing to not run for re-election and being, the most vocal member of the Republican caucus to oppose the lieutenant governor's agenda on occasion, I think Patrick does have a tighter hold on his party in the Senate and a bit more influence than he did even last session.
Yeah, he's being replaced by a guy who's handpicked by the lieutenant governor to take that spot. So that just speaks to what you're saying. I think one more thing I want to say is just on the infrastructure thing. I think Brad brought this up, but the reason why we have the surplus is the consumption taxes, right? It's the sales tax. And during high inflation, I mean, that is hurting people, and Speaker Phelan has said that. And so costs will go up for construction. Costs will go up to build out infrastructure. But in terms of the wisdom, the financial prudence of how to use a surplus, maybe a one-time expenditure isn't a bad idea, rather than putting it towards property taxes, which will keep coming back up and keep coming back up and keep coming back up. And I'm sure if you really wanted to make the argument for spending it on infrastructure, you can say Joe Biden's going to lead us down this path that's going to lead to a recession, and during recessions, construction costs are going to be cheaper. So, I don't know.
Related to property taxes on that, I've seen a lot more interest in eliminating the M&O rate for school districts, especially among Republicans. Now the problem with that is if you spend all this money to do that, you have to be able to do that every session, every biennium. And where do you get that money when you don't have
They
this?
talk about it like you could just eliminate it, but it's
Right.
like you just got to
Right.
keep eliminating it. So you got to keep paying it.
Yeah, but the governor mentioned during his campaign putting Texas on a path towards eliminating the M&O rate. It's a lot easier said than done, but I hadn't seen him come out that much for that before. And what they do this session on property taxes will determine a lot of what happens down the road in bienniums to come.
I'm struck by this discussion, that a part of this discussion I was trying to get you guys to bite on a little bit, so I'll just throw it out there again, which is, none of you have talked about health care, but also nobody's mentioned in any sustained way revisiting abortion. You guys mentioned briefly, or Niki, you did and so I'm going to throw this to you, the LGBTQ, particularly transgender legislation. How much oxygen is there for this? I mean, in a way, there's this notion of the Senate passing all this stuff, and then, as they did during that session you were talking about, sending carts of bills over to the House. How much energy is there to revisit those issues? Not in, James, you mentioned the grassroots, and I'm always a little I always have questions about that term, but we'll set that aside. I think about it more as highly organized grass tops, but anyway. It does feel to me like the focus of the discussion, public sense for the most part, is not on those issues. I mean, you see it amongst, people on Twitter, in, narrower bands of public discussion. I'm wondering how much of an appetite there is within the chambers for this, or if it's a little bit more of something that's familiar to people that have been around for a bit longer, where people deal with those issues as forced because most folks don't really want to take votes on a lot of those issues. Now, I think that dynamic has changed as the internal composition of the Republican Party has changed, but I think it's still an open question as to whether we're at a critical mass on that or not.
I think it was very intentional that the lieutenant governor didn't include those issues on his list of priorities, and I think James has said this before. That doesn't necessarily mean it won't end up on his list to accomplish during the session, but I think there actually is a lot of energy or momentum surrounding LGBTQ issues from the grassroots, just based on the candidates' campaigns and the number of bills that have been filed on the topic. And so I think I wouldn't be surprised if, the issue is raised later in the session once a lot of the, bread and butter issues are dealt with.
On terms of the grassroots, which there's internal fighting in the conservative grassroots anyway. But one thing they're all pretty in lockstep on, especially as a top priority, is banning gender modification surgeries for minors. And that passed through the Senate last year, died in the House. And I think we're again going to see a really big push among Republicans to get that through. And that is something that the severity of it, the fact that it involves children, as we're seeing with a lot of these other issues, there are a lot of Republicans that aren't just, quote, conservative grassroots Republicans that will support something like that. And, obviously we have no idea how it's going to be done, what do they ban, in what manner do they ban them. But I think that is probably the driving force of any of these issues that fall under that umbrella. And it might be the top social issue, unless you count school vouchers as a social issue, but that's kind of one foot in two different corners there. So, yeah.
Since we're talking about social issues, I do want to ask specifically about, what we think about the prospects of revisiting rape and incest exceptions in the abortion realm. Because I think, we're getting, obviously Democrats want to push that. I think some Republicans are clearly dead set against it, but I think the middle out there is pretty broad. And that's, for us, it's, it's a section of, we know where the public is on that as a whole, that there would not be a general outcry against this among the public, given what we know about public attitudes, including among Republicans. But what is the dynamic inside the chambers and among the leadership? There's a headline somewhere today about, Patrick being sort of not committed to this, which is not surprising, as a signal anyway. But I'm wondering what your reporting tells you about that.
Yeah, I think in certain ways I see this like I was at the Dallas Morning News in the run-up to the 2020 election, and there were a couple of embattled Republican House members up there, and when the Democrats were making a big challenge for the House, they were saying, well, maybe we're open to Medicaid expansion, maybe we'll consider it. And then the Republicans won the House, and you didn't hear about it again. I think that's sort of the situation. Like before the election, you can't say, well, maybe we're interested in these exceptions. But then you come back around to after the election, and there's not a whole lot of interest. I think what you're alluding to is our good friend Karina Kling had previews of her interview with the lieutenant governor, in which he said, he kind of downplayed. Like she said, some members have brought it, or some senators have brought it up, and he said 2, a very specific 2. And that's not a lot in a chamber of 31, right? So I think he's throwing some cold water on it. I think the speaker has also said he's not sure if the votes are there for that. And that's an easy way to sort of get around it and say, hey.
No, it's at times like this that leadership starts paying a lot of attention to the will of the body.
Yeah, right. And then the other thing I was going to say just about the other social issues, right now it's just like it's the pregame. It's like if you've been watching World Cup, it's just like Alexi Lalas bloviating about something, or if you're an NBA fan, it's like Charles Barkley and Shaq just saying whatever crazy thing they're gonna say, and we don't really know what the good part's gonna be, right? You want it to be like a college basketball game, like in May, and turn it on, and it's like 61-62, and Duke has the ball. It's just like that's right now. It's just like all ideas, and all these like the good stuff hasn't even really come out.
And do you think that was a massive dose of sports metaphors?
Sorry.
And also maybe the first and last time you will ever hear the governor and lieutenant governor compared to Shaq and Charles Barkley.
We're talking about the lieutenant governor's broad list of priorities. I think in the Senate they reserved 30 bill numbers for priorities. In the House it was 20, so that's a lot. It's a lot of stuff, and I'm sure there's multiple pieces of legislation for each of what the lieutenant governor, the broad topic that he mentioned, but there's a lot to go around in there, and so we might see some things that nobody's talking about on there.
I think and I also think that's a good thing to remember in terms of, I think at this point, we're searching for our keys under the street light, and that's the early bill filings, and the early bill filings are a very mixed indicator at best of what's to come, particularly on the hot agenda items, right? Let's talk a little bit about the politics and the leadership. We were talking about institutional changes in the back, but a little more approximate. Particularly the governor and the lieutenant governor are in an interesting position this session in terms of what expectations are about their future and how that might be affecting what is going to happen moving forward and how they play this session. On the side, we've talked a lot about the lieutenant governor already, but we'll start with him. The sense that this may very well be, he kind of hedged against this, but it seems to me that in the community there's a real expectation that, this is going to be his last term. And even some speculation that he might even, try to manage his transition with this being his last session. Now that is abject speculation. But I'm wondering how you guys think that plays into that, including where we think the governor is now.
Well, if it is his last session, then he'll want to solidify whatever he wants his legacy to be. And he hasn't come out really strong one way or the other on school choice, school vouchers. That is something you could see him supporting, though.
Do you doubt that he's committed to that, whether he mentioned it or not?
Well, I think in an interview on the campaign trail, he mentioned that there's reticence about that, especially in rural areas, and he would consider exempting them from any bill that's passed. But we've yet to see that play out, right? That may happen, that may not. But he really wants the restoring the felony for penalty for illegal voting. I have a hard time believing that doesn't pass. Even in the House, which is often like herding cats, we're going to see a big push for that as well. But strictly about the lieutenant governor, he's going to push as much as he can and wants to, because if this is his last term, this is his second to last go at what he can accomplish in his time in office.
Just to build off of what Brad said, there's a little bit of tying up loose ends that I'm seeing when it comes to, making that little tweak to the elections overhaul bill, also revisiting the issue of the grid, which goes against what both Abbott and Phelan have said. Abbott was pretty clear about saying everything that needed to be done about the grid was done last session. Patrick clearly disagrees and has made it one of his top priorities to accomplish this session. So I think as far as establishing his legacy, really tying up those loose ends, I think is a focus for him.
And I don't know if we've talked about this, but at that presser about his legislative priorities, he kind of put an asterisk on that, and he said, because it was right after the election or a couple of weeks after the election, and said, you guys are stuck with me for 4 more years, or maybe 8 years, he said. So there is an asterisk there as to whether this is his last term. And I'll say, I think sometimes we overthink the lieutenant governor. He is very clear about telling us what he wants, and he is very, just forceful about it. We don't have to read between the tea leaves like we have to do with Abbott or sometimes with the House speakers. And the legislation isn't tricky like it is sometimes in the House. This is a bathroom bill that's not really a bathroom bill. It's if the lieutenant governor has put a stamp on it, he will tell you what it's about, and he will tell you what he wants. I think sometimes we just are overthinking it. I think his record is pretty clear. He is like one of the most conservative, socially conservative, and I don't know fiscally conservative, but I would argue that he probably is conservative lieutenant governors in the history of Texas. Like I don't think that there's a huge doubt about it. I don't know, maybe Brad's audience maybe will have a different take on that.
Niki touched on the grid, and that is going to be one of the biggest...
Masterful change of subject.
Yes, yes. Changing it to what I want to talk about. This is a fight stemming from last session, and Niki mentioned the governor said everything that was done, that needed to be done was done. Now, I would temper that a bit, saying that in July, after the regular session ended, and after Abbott said that, he issued a couple directives to the PUC, one of which was sticking reliability costs with renewable generators. So I think, in my opinion, the comment about everything that needed to be done was done was more about the physical changes, the weatherization, the fixing the critical infrastructure loophole that caused natural gas suppliers to be shut off from power, the main fuel we use to power the grid in the first place. And so on this, on the market stuff, we saw last session one of the biggest fights in the entire session that maybe nobody really cared about because it's so esoteric. The pulling back the money that was exchanged hands during the storm and redistributing it to whichever way it should have gone. A lot of debate on that. Both sides have valid points on it. But this issue, the market redesign, is even more complicated because it's all about market incentives. How do we get people, these companies that are looking 10, 20, 30 years down the road, how do we get them the right signals in order to drive investment towards dispatchable power? That's what the Republicans in the legislature are focusing on. Dispatchable being natural gas, coal to a lesser extent, nuclear applies in there as well. Batteries has been kind of thrown in there also. Anything that can be turned on basically in the flip of a switch on demand. It's not that simple, but basically. Now, how do you do that? The governor had said that we need to, like I said, stick these reliability costs with the renewable generators for when they don't show up when they're supposed to. But this PUC plan kind of tries to accomplish the same thing, but do it through a different way, rewarding the people who do show up with financial incentives. Now, nothing has been decided, and nothing will be decided until this session is over with because the legislature wants its say. And that this week became abundantly clear.
Well, and remember, that's, PUC and ERCOT are under sunset this time. And so there's a vehicle that, even if you wanted this to go away, it's not going away because decisions have to be made. And there are, and this is an area where the interest group community is pretty mobilized on all sides of this. And so I think there's no way for this to go away. Where do you see the governor weighing in on all this? I think there's something we should be used to, which is at this point, as James was kind of implying, everybody wants clear signals from the governor at this point, and we never get them at this point, right? And I think that's a little bit about where we are right now. You each had issues as we were talking about. Pick an issue you want to talk about before we go to Q&A that we've either not gone deep enough on, although you're not allowed to talk anymore about energy, and let's talk a little bit about something we haven't touched on enough in your view before we open it up for questions. James?
Yes, I will talk about the change from the governor, a clear signal, which is a rarity from him sometimes, but on the opioid crisis and how he wants to tackle the opioid crisis. We're going to have another panel on the border, and we're going to have a great conversation about it, but another effect of the border crisis is the fentanyl coming through into Texas and into the country and how we deal with it. And the governor has started talking about things like supporting the decriminalization of fentanyl testing strips, providing more Narcan, having it be more available to the public and to police departments. And those are shifts in his sort of way of thinking, or at least on his emphasis when it comes to Narcan, but definitely a shift in the decriminalization of fentanyl test strips that, scientists, researchers, opioid use experts say those are actually the right approach to solving this issue. And sometimes, because we live in Texas, and because we have such tough on crime lawmakers, we go down the road of having tough on crime policies, which don't really help people who are actually addicted to whether it's opioids or drug or whatever substance it may be. But this time he's signaling things that researchers and experts are saying are science-based approaches to how to do it. And that's opening the gate for people in the legislature, both Democrats who have already favored these approaches, and now Republicans. I saw a decriminalization of fentanyl testing strips bill filed by Nathan Johnson of Dallas and Bob Hall. Not two guys that you usually see together. So I think that's just gonna be a really fascinating topic.
Okay, before we move on to Niki, James, I do want to give you a chance, and I want to preview your panel. So I do want to ask you about border security, but I want to ask you something really specific that I still remember you and I talking about on the street 3 or 4 months ago somewhere. Where do you see the dynamics of border security spending in the budget? Because the spending on Operation Lone Star and on border security is, to my mind, one of the most singular things that we've seen in Texas politics in terms of the magnitude of the increase in a very short period of time. And I'm wondering how that is going to play out in the budget process this time, because Republicans are in a difficult position. I mean, on one hand, I've lost track of where the number is, and some of you've worked on this, and colleagues at the Tribune and ProPublica on the spending level, but I think we're way north of $4 billion now. Go back 10 years and it was less than $1 billion easily, by a long shot. But I also think that it's hard for me to imagine, I can't think of any Republican that would stand up in a committee and say, hey, you know what, I think we're spending a little too much on border security. What's your view of that now? You and I talked about that a while. We were both speculating.
And that's exactly the point. And it's not only that it's like the Republican members of the legislature, but the broad general public supports Operation Lone Star and supports the move that we're making, whether it's the deployment of National Guard service members, the sending of troopers, or this migrant busing program that has started. The general public supports this, and the governor sees that. And then the big number that comes out, other than the $4 billion, is 2 million crossings. The most crossings that we've seen at the border in recorded history, really. And so when you look at that, you say, okay, we do need to spend the money. Now there is going to be a debate, and there really should be a debate about how much spending we should be doing. But in every conversation that I've had with state lawmakers about it, it's and the governor is very good at making this point. It's like, well, if the feds aren't going to do it, if Joe Biden isn't going to do it, then we need to do it. And we actually have some people here who are going to talk in our panel about like what the effect is on their communities. And it is a very real effect, and it is a very real impact. And I've been down to these communities, and it's real. And so when lawmakers go talk to these folks, they say, wow, we really got to take care of this. So I expect that the spending will continue, probably at the level that it is. I think they sort of wised up and said, we don't need these 10,000 National Guard servicemen. I put quotations around that because I don't think it really ever was 10,000 at the border, but 10,000 National Guard service members. I think they're at a little below 5,000 now. So it's, that makes it a little bit more manageable.
Well, and for all the, we sort of ding the governor for being ambiguous in some ways, but this is something he is not ambiguous about at all.
Very clear about it, very clear.
Right. So Niki, issue that we haven't touched on enough you want to talk about?
Yeah, I've done a lot of reporting in the past 6 months on the mass shooting in Uvalde, and Senator Roland Gutierrez has really taken this on as his focus for the upcoming legislative session, and has a number of measures he's suggested, many of which I anticipate will go nowhere in a Republican-dominated chamber. But I am curious how Republicans will handle, the mental health crisis that we're having. That's what Republicans choose to focus on when we're having this conversation about mass shootings. And so what will the investment look like in our state's mental health care infrastructure? It's something both Patrick and Phelan and Abbott all seem to agree on, that there needs to be more investment in adding more inpatient care beds for psychiatric facilities, adding more funding to the mental health system for more providers. We have I think we're at the bottom of the list when it comes to the most uninsured people and kids especially in the state. So something I'll be keeping an eye on is how, what the appropriations look like for mental health care.
Well, and I think inevitably the Medicaid waiver comes up on that, but the politics of that I still, there are people in this room that will know a lot more about that. I'm trying hard not to look at too closely, but I think that enters into that. I think there's something interesting about, and sadly interesting, that's what's going to create an opportunity, that the shootings are going to create an opportunity for things that are probably not directly related to that in terms of paying more attention to those issues. Brad?
One of the things I find most interesting going to this session is something that probably won't get a lot of attention and won't get a lot of support is the emergency powers reform. This was a huge issue going into the session last year, and then the power grid failure kind of took all the oxygen out of the room for it. And it already presented an interesting dynamic where if they were to pass anything curtailing the governor's powers, you'd have to have the governor himself sign it, unless you get a veto-proof majority, which is very difficult to do. But we have seen some bills filed to do that, to restrict some of those abilities again. But it kind of seemed like that was the only time anything was going to pass on this, because it was so contemporary at that moment. There were just orders still in effect during the legislative session, a lot fewer than during 2020, but this was still a very top of mind issue, and that's no longer the case, I don't think. I think it'd be a miracle if anything passed on that.
Well, the politics of that really informed the gubernatorial primary on the Republican side, and Republicans seem to have weighed in fairly decisively on that. I mean, that was one of the centerpieces, really, of both of the major candidates that opposed the governor, and they didn't get traction on it.
Yeah, especially when they first jumped in the race, and then the topic kind of shifted to vaccine mandates, which ties into emergency powers, but ultimately went nowhere, and we saw where the governor finished in a four-person, many more people than that, but mainly four-person challenge to his status as the Republican nominee.
I want to open it up for questions. I don't know what the microphone situation is. Oh, there we go. Mic's on both sides of the room, so please, if you have a question for the panel, now's the moment. Over here, sir.
Thank you. Good morning. There's a tradition in our legislature of preempting the decisions made by our municipalities, specifically municipalities named Austin. I was wondering if you saw any of those issues getting traction this session, and if not preemption, are there other ways you can talk to us about the friction between urban Texas and the rest of Texas?
One of my side beats is covering the city of Austin, and that has been a big topic recently. I think you asked about preemption specifically. One of the issues would be whether these cities are allowed to pay for logistics to abortion services. The city of Austin did that. I've seen at least one bill filed to eliminate that possibility. Then there's the really big one by Representative Jared Patterson to make Austin a capital district. I don't know if that's going to go anywhere. Probably bet on not, but he's definitely banging the drum on it. And there are a lot of Republicans that agree with that, especially after the homelessness stuff. When they came last year to the city and they see these camps all over the place, after a couple of years of seeing these camps all over the place, there was a lot of appetite for doing something, and we saw the statewide camping ban pass. I don't think there's enough support to make the entire city a district, but it's definitely something that is discussed not derogatorily in a lot of Republican circles.
The other thing that I would bring up is the taxpayer-funded lobbying legislation, which I don't think there's been a whole lot of talk about, but Mays Middleton, that's his big project. It was in the House, and now he's over in the Senate, and he'll have much more support over there. But if he's gone from the House, it's unclear to me. I don't know if you know, Brad, who's going to file it in the House, which has been the big defense on that. So that'll be interesting to see. But that's one of those issues that it's well, it hasn't bubbled up yet, but I'm sure lots of folks are working on it and looking at it.
There have been 2 bills filed to do that in the House, I think, at least on the first day. But again, who's going to be the guy to carry that? It was Middleton, and now there's a vacuum.
I think one of the things is, what is you raised homelessness, you guys have, James, you raised a more specific area. I think the question is, what is the vehicle issue-wise that really fuels that? And I'm not sure what's really out there looming this time. I think, that really drives it, particularly in the House.
One more thing, you asked about the broader topic of state versus local. This is something I'm very interested in because it involves a lot of history. What was the authority of the municipalities when they originally created by the state? Does the state have the ability to come in where it wants to pare back on that authority? And so one contemporary issue that's going to tie into that is this fight at the ballot box in Austin over removing the Office of Police Oversight from the labor contract. And that ties into this section of state code that provides protections for cops. And that centrally is what the cops want to protect. The city wants them to kind of renounce that provision, that protection, and these deliberations have kind of stalled out because of that. But that also, it ties in is it the state's authority to do this, or is it the city's authority to regulate this? Where do we fall on that? That is something that underpins quite literally every issue in the state of Texas, and it's never going away, that contention.
Good morning. You spoke a bit about vouchers. I have a question in addressing public schools. Do you see them tackling the measurable workforce issue, the lack of teachers in our public schools? And then part 2 to that, do you see them tackling recapture, financing, funding, maybe shifting from an attendance to an enrollment type funding model? So 2 parts, workforce, teachers, and then the second part is funding.
What are the signals on some of the hardest issues out there?
Do you want to go, Niki?
I do feel like there's a lot of appetite for, increasing teacher pay in order to address that problem. I think that comes up every legislative session. I just think whether it has the momentum to actually lead to any measurable result is the question. I've also heard a lot about increasing the basic allotment for students and trying to get school districts more funding that way. I don't know that the energy around that right now is making me very optimistic about whether there will be any significant results this session, but I think there are definitely a number of lawmakers where that's their top issue. So I think it'll be a conversation. I just don't know that we can tell at this point in the legislative season whether we'll see any results.
What the lieutenant governor and his priorities put out, getting teachers pay raises and getting retired teachers a cost of living adjustment or a 13th check. Now, it's all great to have a wish list, but then you got to get down to the nitty gritty and then work out the numbers in the budget. We do have a big surplus, so will we use it on that? The lieutenant governor is indicating that he wants to use it to that. I think we have to wait, going back to it, we're still in the pregame. We had to wait to see where Speaker Phelan is and where the House is. But, just the way the House works, you got to think that they're going to do something on public education, on trying to get more money to teachers. But again, if it's a one-time surplus do you really want to commit to pay raises for ongoing expenditures there? And then the other thing I would say about Robin Hood stuff and the allotment is that there's still a lot of things happening from the school legislation law that was passed in 2019 that it takes a couple of years to kick in. So whenever I talk to people like Diego Bernal, who was one of the leaders on that legislation, he said we still have to wait for it to kick in. There's still things happening, and Donna Howard's looking at me suspectly. So, but that there are still things happening. So I think just got to give it some time. But I imagine. You have all this red meat that you want to throw out there. You want to keep the base happy, but particularly in the House, I think there is a strong support for public education and for making things right with teachers and for doing a lot of the nitty gritty, and in the House too. Senator Taylor was really big on this, but for doing the nitty gritty of these specific issues that we're talking about.
I also think it's important to note that a lot of the red meat cultural issues that Republicans are focusing on center around schools, around curriculum, how teachers are able to discuss racism and sexism in the classroom, restrictions on which sports teams transgender kids can play on, that makes teachers' work environment very difficult, and a lot of teachers who are leaving the field now have cited as the reason why they're choosing to retire or choose a different profession. And so I still see those school-based culture war issues as being a focus for Republicans this session. And so I think it will also be a balance of, if the legislature is able to give teachers a pay raise, will it outweigh the additional hardships that they're enduring in their jobs right now? And I think we'll just have to wait and see.
There are two interesting factors that are gritting this discussion, right? One is obviously the money, right? And I think, we've had some discussion about, there is a dynamic here that it's like a household economics, that when you have a windfall in your head, you always spend it 5 or 10 times over, beyond what you can actually do. But if you look at that with the agenda signals that we're seeing, most prominently recently from the lieutenant governor, but from other actors in the political system, what we're beginning to see, and I think this really mostly when you were talking, Niki, about or one of you was mentioning the lieutenant governor talking about teacher pay raises. It's sort of everybody's putting the objects on the table that are available for horse trading. Now, some things are on the table more implicitly. I mean, I don't read much into the fact that the governor lieutenant governor doesn't say much about vouchers in public, because I think we'd all be shocked if it wasn't one of those things on there. But that's where we are, I think, in the pregame right here is okay, what is out there? And I think public education will wind up getting pushed a little bit harder as we digest the fact, the fallout from the pandemic and what we've seen in declining test scores and achievement scores. And I mean, across the board.
You think it'll get pushed harder into the conversation or out of the conversation?
I think it pushes it into the conversation because, and Niki's point about how where the energy within the Republican Party has been on these social issues has given them more to push into that discussion, right? And there's more to trade there. Right. So, anybody else? Questions? There's somebody going to the mic, I think.
Hello. I have kind of a follow-up question to that. My mom taught public school for 43 years in Texas, and the pandemic, she had retired and come back half-time, and then the pandemic, she just finally retired. And you had kind of a one-time situation where you had a lot of teachers retiring. Is there any consensus that raising wages for teachers, which of course I would love to see, would address the workforce needs, since we're dealing with the effect of a one-time issue?
I'm going to think a pay raise would probably contribute to that, yeah. There are a lot of issues for why teachers are leaving. One of them was virtual school. That also drove a lot of kids to homeschool. And I don't know if there's going to be any legislation to address that going forward. Now, that would also be it's already happened. All the kids are back in school. So, but we saw a lot of kids regressed during that period. And I'm sure that contributes to how difficult the job of being a teacher is, along with all these other things. So I don't think a pay raise is the only thing that would keep teachers in school, but I'm sure it would help. Yeah, and the last time it happened was in 2019, I believe, and that was coming off an election where Democrats took 12 seats in the House, a couple in the Senate, and so I don't know how much, that dynamic is not there this time. But as James said, the lieutenant governor put it on his list. The Republican lieutenant governor put that on his list, and he tends to get what he wants a lot of times, and so that's going to be a big boon for passing a teacher pay raise, in addition to a 13th check or a COLA for retired teachers.
Last chance for questions. I might actually land this on time. All right, great panelists, terrific reporters. Please give our panelists a hand. Thanks for the great questions. Enjoy the rest of the day.